Hello everyone, welcome back to the fourth session of our conflict resolution series, our boot camp on how to look at conflict resolution and resolve the issues on the Korean Peninsula. My name is Dr. Roland Wilson. As you can see, we've already had many great events, 4 sessions, and if you have attended or you're going to attend these sessions, you're going to have a great time working in the group work we're going to do. The table of content we see here today is we're going to go over these in great detail. We're going to spend just a couple of moments talking about what you learned in the past. Then we're going to move to the untapped potential of the Korean Peninsula, along with some basic assumptions and challenges. We're going to move on to talk about some primary theories that really relate well to what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. Next, we're going to think about what can we do and what do they want? What does North Korea want? And actually, what does South Korea want as well out of unification? And then finally, how do we get there? So let's get started. First of all, just like the first in every session, we want to thank everybody for being here. We know, again, in the time of coronavirus, that's not easy to do. Everybody gets a little bit fatigued also from being online all the time and listening to Zoom meetings. We wish that you were here in person. Then, of course, we hope that you join us for the offline workshop we're going to do at the end of these series. Also, we have to thank Unification Foundation again for the great support and the partnership. And it's just for this year, for past years as well. Without the support of organizations like this, we certainly can't do what we're trying to do to bring education, knowledge, and outreach to everyone dealing with conflicts in this part of the world. And finally, again, just like in the first session, I hope that this is a start, not the end of a long-term conversation. We need to have as individuals, as groups, and as governments to try to resolve this conflict peacefully. So, as I said, this is the 4th session. We've had 3 sessions before. I led the first session on all about conflict and resolution. The second session was led by Dr. Lim from our Global Affairs program. She talked about, of course, what do you think of North and South Korea and about the unification process in general. The third session was led by Dr. Khan from our conflict and resolution program, and she spoke about the regional and global politics and the political understanding of what's going on. When there's no unification, then unification. So like all the sessions, we're going to also, this is being recorded in advance, but we're certainly going to break these sessions down into 15-minute interviews where we're going to have group work with the different scholars that attend this, and of course come up with our own understanding moving forward. Additionally, as I said in the first lecture, when we started this series, or these sessions, that this is not intended for experts, but this is intended for everyone to maybe get a better understanding of what's going on here in Korea and in the larger East Asian region. So again, welcome, and let's get started. So before this final session, I want to talk about the most important part to me, and that's some assumptions. We always have to have general assumptions on what's going on here, and we can't always depend on merely news events or hearing it from secondhand sources. So hopefully the assumptions and then the challenges and opportunities we speak about today is going to give you a better understanding of how we can move forward, how you can move forward to help with this conflict resolution, this unification process. So here are some assumptions. First of all, we know that North and South Korea and the division of it, now over 70 years long, is the first test of the Cold War, and it's still the last and remaining symbol of all the ugliness within this part of the world during the Cold War period. Sadly, so it is. Also, North and South Korean people, the people are not entirely different. Of course, as we know, before the Korean War, after the end of World War II, and before it was separated into the 2 states, they were one people. They all want to live in freedom, they all want to survive, and they all want to be happy. That's a basic assumption for everyone in all countries, by the way. Additionally, we know that North Korea's intent, as in the government's intent, can never be fully understood. We can never know what's in somebody else's, some other government's mind, but it shouldn't prevent us, it should never prevent us from trying diversified efforts of helping with change and moving forward for the future. In other words, regardless of what a country may do or not do, we still have to engage with them. So some more assumptions. The Korean Peninsula is what we consider a deep-rooted and protracted social conflict, or a PACSC for short. Also, our European colleagues sometimes refer to it as a frozen conflict. That is because, of course, as we said earlier, it's been around for a very long time. Also, when we deal with North Korea, as when governments deal with North Korea, it's almost always been exclusively with negotiations and done by government officials. and those acting for the government's behalf. So therefore, it's been really very little contact we've had with them. Also, if you look at how to resolve or transform the issues with North Korea, you have to look long term. John Paul Lederach once said it's going to take generational change to make a difference. And of course, North and South Korea, there's going to be no difference. It's going to take generations of change and transformation to make this work. Now, if we look at North Korea and South Korea now, we can also see there's uniquely two different histories, two different ways of looking at their own culture and identities, and certainly even the language has changed somewhat as well. In other words, we have to bridge those key factors first, or at least in the beginning. North and South Korea also have a very different understanding of we-ness, who I am and who you are, and therefore who can we be together as separate countries or together as one country. Trauma is something we never really talk about, but we know that any country that's been through trauma in the past or the current continues to have that trauma until today. This transgenerational trauma, as many refer to it, has to be looked at, has to be addressed. Whenever we get new North Koreans that come down to South Korea, or after unification as well, we have to continue to address trauma at all the different levels of society and work on that on a daily basis. Most people, when they look at North and South Korea, they want to look at the the German unification model. Of course, it has some great lessons learned. German unification is excellent. Of course, there's still differences between East and West Germany even till today. We have to keep in mind, though, that when it comes to North and South Korea, it's very different. A different culture, a different people, a different society and region of the world. Also, the lengthened differences over time has greatly been exacerbated by that time period. Also, North and South Korea, the people, should be part of any peace process. Later on, we're going to talk about who's involved in peace processes and who's not. And what we mean by this is the governments and governments alone can't resolve every issue within the world we have. We have to learn to coexist. We have to learn about each other. So therefore, the people, North and South Koreans, must be involved in the peace process we have. Additionally, currently we have more than 30,000 former North Koreans or diaspora living around the world. In South Korea alone, we have about that much. The thing is, though, we have to remember is we have to learn how to meet their needs, to be able to understand them, to be able to coexist with them and integrate them into our society. We're going to have any chance of doing that at a state level, meaning entire North and South Korea together over a long period of time. Also, we have to look at countries in a whole. We've seen what's happened in Afghanistan recently. We've seen what happened in different countries in the Middle East and other parts of the world. Outside governments really can't change governments. It takes that, at the end of the day, it takes the people of that country, in this case, North Korea, to want to and be able to of creating change within their own country. That change has to take place if we're going to be changed as a people, as a North and South Koreans together. Again, though, governments can't do it by themselves, and we can't change North Korean government or the people. The people must be the lead, or at least assist in that change in any way they can. Additionally, most people talk about sanctions and the effects of sanctions, but we know that sanctions over time loses their ability to affect the other. Sanctions is more of a punitive action, and also, of course, to prevent the sale of weapons of mass destruction and other technologies. But at the end of the day, having sanctions for year after year, it doesn't really work. It does more harm than good. Why? Sanctions have been on North Korea for almost 70 years now, but North Korea survived until today. They continue to get the things that they need, at least at the government level. Of course, the people doesn't get what they need. So therefore, the sanctions do more harm, harming the North Korean people. It doesn't really do a lot of harm on the North Korean government. Also, when we talk about conflicts, and especially a long, protracted social conflict like North Korea, we have to think of a disease and a symptom. You know, a lot of people nowadays, when they talk about North Korea and resolving the issues, they want to talk about nuclear weapons, they want to talk about missiles. But those things are not the disease itself. The disease is a conflict that's happened for over 70 years now, starting with the Korean War, if we want to go back then, or even further. Symptoms of it is, what is North Korea doing now? What is South Korea doing now that's going to harm the other, could harm another? And of course, the nuclear weapons and missiles and other type of actions are the symptoms of this long-term conflict or disease, as I call it. So therefore, we have to start looking at the disease and not just the symptoms of that disease. Additionally, when it comes to the ROC Alliance, the U.S. ROC Alliance, both the political alliance and the military alliance, I believe, and many believe, that it's going to remain important regardless of whether there's unification or not, or even after unification. The U.S. military alliance within this region is going to be very important for the greater region and the security and the peace of the people within the region. Without security, how can you really have peace? That's an interesting question, right? It's the balance between the two we have to learn to understand and meet and make sure that any presence of foreign militaries within the region or different alliances are not looked at as an offensive capability, but more of a stabilizing capability that can help with a variety of issues on the Korean Peninsula. Such things, for example, the U.S. military alliance can help with a variety of natural man-made disasters, can help with anti-piracy and many other things happening within the region itself. So let's talk about the potential now, because I really believe I've had experience in the Korean Peninsula since 1984, a very long period of time. And I know that there's unlimited potential for the Korean Peninsula to become a leader, not only a leader in a combined country, but a leader within the region. And this, in fact, the world. We've seen this, for example, in South Korea, by only on the hard work and the backbone of the citizens of South Korea, came from a donor, came from a user of OECD aid to a donor, one of the top donors now, helping other countries develop after their development here in South Korea. What can an entire peninsula do together? Unlimited potential, as I said earlier. However, for the Korean Peninsula, once and if it's unified, has to think about the historical and territorial conflicts that still hurts the potential of the unified peninsula. For example, there are still a variety of historical interpretations, revisions of key events, and different territorial issues we've had within the region that affect North and South Korea and Japan, North and South Korea and China, and many other countries within the region. On the surface, they may not look to be a big deal. They're all historical. They're all in the past. However, if we continue to allow these past events to affect how we look at the other and affect friends within the region, it's going to be very, very hard for the Korean Peninsula to have its full effect, to live up to its full potential as a leader within the region. So we hope that we can really work on these other issues within the region at the same time. So challenges and opportunity. There's many challenges and opportunity we have to look at. For example, we know that North Korea is ripe for change. This is the time to really look at trying to reach out and have engagement with North Korea and the North Korean people. The problem is we have a short, limited time to do that. We've waited 70 years. We have a new leader who's been in government now for a long period of time in North Korea, and we probably don't have more than 3 or 5 years left before North Korea learns once again to live on its own without unification process happening. If that happens, it's going to be a great loss, I believe, to the people within the Korean Peninsula and to the greater region. Also, when we look at the deep-rooted protracted social conflict between North and South Korea, we have to look at how we can change it. Right now, it hasn't changed tremendously over the last 70 years. So how can we change that conflict, the dynamics of it, to look at what's happened and what hasn't happened, and try to make it work for the people within Korea, first and foremost, before any outside people, nation, or interest we may have. Also, we have to understand that this negative piece has been going along for a long time is going to affect us unless we're really willing to change. We have to understand that hard power by itself or the threat of military force and provocations can't be the lead to make change happen. We have to be able to make that change happen without the use of these more hard type of power and threats of power and provocations to make it happen. We have to also understand in order for that to happen, we have to get away from purely negotiations with the other and look at how to get others involved within the process. Negotiation by itself doesn't work. We looked at, many people had great hopes for the Trump-Kim Hanoi summit, for example. The problem is how can we look at negotiation as an end to a conflict that's happened for 70 years and have it end after just 1 or 2 meetings between leaders? That's impossible to happen. We have to look at the long-term deep roots of the conflict and start working on these different variety of issues, whether it be language, culture, education, engagement, how to learn to live together as partners first, and then how to live together as a family together again. It's just like dating. Before you can get married, you have to start dating and get to know each other. And believe me, North and South Korea needs that dating period as well. So therefore, we need to stop pinning our hopes on just long-term, or pardon me, short-term negotiations and summit meetings to make it happen. So we're going to take a break now. And during the break, the actual break, we're going to have students break out into groups. We're talking about some of these assumptions, and then how can they make their own assumptions for what's going on between North and South Korea. Additionally, then we're going to come back and we're going to look at key theories, conflict analysis and resolution theories that really point to what's happening within the Korean Peninsula context. So we'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you. Welcome back. I hope you learned a lot during the first part of this session, where we talked about the challenges, the opportunities, and some of the assumptions, the primary assumptions needed to really understand what North and South Korea may want, and also how to go forward with unification process. In this part, and this next 15 minutes, we're going to talk about CAR theories, conflict analysis resolution theories that are relevant to what's going on. We're also going to talk in detail, or at least in some detail with the limited time we have, about what North and South Korea really wants or may want for unification process to happen. So let's get started. First of all, let's talk about power. Power is something everybody should understand. We all have it. Some have more than others, and there's certainly different kinds of power. In the traditional sense, we look at power, we think of such things as soft power, in other words, economic aid. K-pop, for example, is another term we use for soft power. How do we reach out to other countries and have them interact with us? That's different forms of soft power. We have hard power, the opposite of that. Such things as sanctions, as we have with North Korea, military force, the threat of military force, and other types of more strenuous, strong means to deal with other countries within the region. And of course, that's hard power. And then we have a combination of the two called smart power. So there's three different types of power, but there's also another type of power, and that's what's considered real and perceived types of power. It's based off of one's status, for example, compared to others. Some people, if you deal with different countries, they could base their power off the perceived power of the other. Do they have a larger military than I have? Do they have more manpower than I have? Do they have a larger economy than I have? Certainly there's differences in perceived and real power between North and South Korea if we look at it in that way. And that goes also into what we refer to as positioning, or positioning theory. Positioning theory is very important because it's just not how you are positioned within the conflict. Remember, we're all parties within the conflict itself, but how do you position the other? Is that position based off of your military rank if you're in the military? Is it based off of your position within the government? Are you a foreign policy advisor? Are you within the administrations itself? Those are all different types of position. Not only do you have your position, but you have the other's position. So sometimes differences in position lead in or feed into the play on power. So the position and power moving together can really hurt different relationships and how we look at the other. On the contrary, though, if you look at how to reposition yourself and reposition the other, in other words, try to lower down the perceived threat that the other may have, and of course, the threat that you may have toward the other. If you lower those positions, or at least balance those out and have mutual respect for each other, then you're not going to worry so much about the power and the relationship itself. It's not just about real power, but it's about the perceived amount of power and the position you may have. Additionally, when you have differences in position and power, you have differences in how we deal with it. It's called asymmetric tools. And we know that North and South Korea, because there's a difference in real and perceived power and differences in their positions, normally they deal with each another on an asymmetric basis. And that's what we want to try to alleviate or change within the future. Autistic hostility is a great theory to understand the Korean Peninsula. As we said earlier, the Korean Peninsula has been in a conflict for more than 70 years now. So when you have that breaking contact, meaning that you're not meeting the other on a regular basis, you have negative views that come to the surface. And those negative views of the other, just like when you avoid a conflict, the longer you avoid the conflict, the more you don't like the other. So therefore, the positions and how you think of the other becomes very rigid, and it prevents positive change or positive thoughts of the other from happening. So autistic hostility is a great, great theory to understand the Korean Peninsula with. So when you have it in your position, how do you create trust if you don't have contact? And that's our next theory. Contact theory tells us the opposite. Instead of autistic hostility, let's have less autistic hostility based on contact. Meaning if we have contact, with the other on a variety of levels, not just at the individual, not the state level, but at a variety of levels over a long period of time, and you have that social interaction, there's less likelihood to have conflict with the other, or at least you start to build the basis for relationships. Without contact, how can you have relationships? How can you learn to live together? How can you engage the other successfully and come about the unification process? So contact theory is very important to counterbalance this autistic hostility that exists between North and South Korea, and for that matter, between North Korea and the United States. So when you have contact, though, there's many different types of contact you can have. You can have positive contact based on direct, high-quality contact, meaning meeting in groups and individuals with the other on a regular basis. You can also do other types of contact, indirect, high-quality contact, such as having news reports about the other, showing different movies that talks about the other different ways where you don't have a direct influence on the other, but that indirect influence can be just as powerful, just as positive in nature, that helps with that relationship. And again, lowers that level of autistic hostility and creates a better chance for relationships to begin. So now we're going to get into what North and South Korea want, or at least what we think they may want. And this is very important for you to understand, because we're going to be doing group work on this the key point here. Let's look at North Korea, for example. North Korea has two unchanging views of the Korean Peninsula in general. First of all, North Korea believes that the division of the Korean Peninsula was due to outside external forces, outside imperial forces, meaning primarily the United States and the UN forces that came in to intervene with the conflict between North and South Korea. Now, of course, they could be referring to prior to that as well, and that is the division of the Korean Peninsula by the winning powers of World War II. Regardless of their first main point of view is that external forces caused this, and we're going to make it better ourselves. The second is that they want to realize their independence. They want to have unification, but they want to have it based on the entire country on their own. In other words, they want to achieve unification based on what's considered anti-unification, getting rid of South Korea, getting rid of all the unification, or the military forces within South Korea that are against North Korea, meaning the U.S. forces stationed in South Korea and also United Nations Command in South Korea. So first and foremost, in order to have unification, they want to make sure that we get rid of all forces within South Korea that are not South Korean forces. And they want to make sure they have independence by themselves, meaning they're going to do it on their own. The next is North Korea also speaks about the implied term, the chosen nation, first policy. As you know, first policy is a slogan within North Korea itself. Chosen nation is also a slogan within North Korea. They also talk about having an exclusive, isolated nation, meaning on their own. And that subject, and that this new nation has to be controlled by a supreme leader under Juche ideology. So in other words, they do want unification, but how do they want unification? They want unification under their form of government and their form of rule in order to make it happen, without any foreign forces involved in it. So South Korea, the Moon administration came out recently with 3 stages, a three-phase unification process. First of all, they talk about the value of peace and making peace the highest priority and the foundation for prosperity, not just within South Korea, but on the Korean Peninsula itself. Also, the Moon administration talks about the spirit of mutual respect. In other words, how can you respect each another in order to go forward for unification processes? And with that, they talk about the 3 no's. They say that the Moon administration says the South Korean government has no desire for North Korea to collapse as a country and as an economy. They also don't want to pursue unification based on absorbing North Korea. And finally, they do not want to create an artificial means for unification with North Korea, meaning, in other words, that the South Koreans and the Americans, for example, they do not want to force unification on North Korea by military or hard power means to do so. Also, South Korea talks a lot about open policy, to be honest and complete in how they look at North Korea and have the public participate in any type of policy issues when it comes to North Korea. In other words, just like North Korea, South Korea does want a unification, but under a liberal democracy as we talk about it. And as you can see on the slide, we talk about at times. I think it's important to bring up here that the younger generations, in fact, the majority of younger South Koreans aren't so focused on unification. They're too focused on their own lives. We've had many instances where South Koreans in different types of conflict resolution situations, we've had them in, probably in the workshops, they talk about, why should I sacrifice for the other? Why should I have sacrificed for North Koreans in order to have unification process? So there's a difference between the younger generation in South Korea and the older generation, and how or if they even want unification to happen. But in a whole, the South Korean government and the South Korean people do want unification, but of course they want democracy and unification process as well. So what does North Korea really want? This is kind of the unspoken words, and these are assumptions, but I think pretty good ones. North Korea wants regime stability and safeguards. In other words, the Kim family must survive. The North Korean government must survive. And they want to have stability within that as well. That's another reason why they have nuclear weapons and long-range missile capability. It's not just asymmetric measures to deal with the South and the perceived threat from the United States and the positions and power of both the South Korea and the United States, but also to assure the stability of the regime itself. They also want to have all sanctions and trade restrictions lifted. Why? It's going to help them grow their economy and to obtain power, economic power and real power within the world community. Additionally, North Korea has a yearning, an unmet need to feel that they're a world leader, at least for the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, to feel like he's a world leader. You saw that with the different summits you've been in, where you have the variety of cameras from North Korea viewing in on what's happening. And of course, the cameras are always not focused on the North and South Korean president together, or South Korean president and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, or not focused on Trump or Kim. They're focusing on Kim and how he looks on the world stage. So recognition on the world stage is very, very important. Also, the North Korean regime wants to have recognition from the United States. That's the reason why, one of the reasons why a lot of times the North Koreans want to have direct dialogue with the United States and not through South Korea. They want to have recognition from the United States, and they also want to show that they can deal with the United States one-on-one. And of course, they want to have symmetry with the South Korea, both in economic, military, and of course, how they look around the world to everybody in the world itself. And finally, they want to have media access. The more the media access the North Korean government has to South Korea in the world, the more they can look more gentle and a more benevolent and great North Korea that they hope to be someday. Now, what does South Korea want? Of course, they want South Korea wants continued economic growth. You know, we've seen South Korea raise from a debtor nation up to, the 10th, even on different index you look at, the 12th to 10th largest economy in the world. What a great accomplishment. So they want to continue with that economic rise. They also want to continue to have leadership role within the region, the world. You see that in the amount of outreach the Moon administration, before the other administrations, has had looking at the world. This is South Korea and the great power that we have, the technology advances, the different advances South Korea has made within the region. Also, they want to have new trade partners. We know that North and South Korea are combined, creates a whole new market for goods, a whole new market for technology and other services that South Korea can provide. It also creates a path to markets in Asia and in Eastern Europe and Russia. Also, the South Koreans want to take the lead in North and South Korean relations. For too many years, many believe that the South Koreans has been not at the forefront of dealing with North Korea, but at the back front, and the U.S. has had the lead. And of course, South Koreans, and they should have the lead in negotiating and working with North Koreans themselves. And also, they want to look at unification of families, reunions with families. Too many South Korean families and North Korean families that were separated at the time of the Korean War are starting to die off. Their ages are at such an advanced age, they must try to meet once again to have some type of physical and mental reconciliation between the different family members. And finally, South Korea, as a liberal democracy, wants human rights to be respected in North Korea as well. But we want to see, at least personally, I'd love to see human rights put more at the forefront in how we deal with North Korea in many different ways. So we're going to go on another break here. And when we actually have this with the students and we're going to break down into groups, we're going to talk about what do you think North and South Korea wants. So the groups of students, both from South Korea, international universities, and also from former North Koreans living in South Korea, we're going to work on what do we really think North and South Korea want, and how can we make those two different diversified thoughts on unification come into one. In other words, how do we meet in the world to have that great mediation negotiation process, make it happen? We'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you. Welcome back to the last section of the session of our Unification Bootcamp. We hope you've enjoyed what you heard the last 4 sessions and the 2 sections of this 4th session today. Look forward to having you through the rest of this time and working together within the groups and then on our bootcamp, on the problem solving workshop we're going to have in the near future. So, before we talk about the actual steps for unification from a conflict analysis resolution perspective, I want to talk about a few things first. We have to first understand that conflicts, there are never simple conflicts. They're all dynamic, they're all complex, and therefore the ways we approach and try to deal with them must be equally dynamic and complex efforts. Meaning that we can't expect 70 years of a conflict to be resolved, as I said earlier, through 1 or 2 meetings. We have to also look at the variety of sub-level or deep-rooted the aspects of that conflict that remain, and then how do we work on each and every one of those at the same time. We can't wait to have unification and then deal with these different complex and dynamic issues. We have to do it along the way. Also, that these diversified efforts, these complex and diversified efforts must be done in a sustained way, through sustained and indirect and direct forms of contact. In other words, people diplomacy efforts as well. We have to learn how to address and work with North Koreans at all levels of society. Additionally, how do we make the sustained contact engagement? When we talk about contact engagement, if we talk about a year, we're going to say we're going to do this for a year. If it doesn't work, we're going to go back to status quo. That's not the way to look at it. We have to look long term and how we deal with it and make sure that we can do this for a long period of time for sustained change within North and South Korea, and sustained change within the region itself. So you see in front of you a pyramid, and I have a question there that's kind of rhetorical. What makes a pyramid so strong? And we know that we make it strong because of the way it's set up. It's strongest at the foundation, then it goes up toward the sky. We know also that a pyramid would not be very strong if it was turned upside down and you had the pyramid in the sand, so to speak, like a point in the sand. Why is this important? If we look at the traditional conflict resolution efforts or traditional state efforts at resolving conflicts, and you see on the circle on the screen, we talk about the elite level of society, meaning government officials themselves, or those working for the government or acting for the government. And if you look at the pyramid on the slide, you have 3 different levels of society. You have the grassroots and the people itself, which is the largest width of the pyramid, so therefore the most amount of people affected. And then you have the middle level, which is normally the middle stakeholders, the people that work on problem-solving workshops, educational organizations, different think tanks and different NGOs and different businesses and business corporations are at the middle level of society. And then, of course, again, back to the top. These interventions or these different levels of existence and different levels of contact with society, that's the problem is when you look at it, it's the other side around. In other words, the pyramid's turned upside down. You have all the efforts, the vast majority of efforts dealing with North Korea, outside of efforts like this through Unity Korea Foundation and other NGOs, the vast majority of efforts to deal with and try to transform and change North Korea, and the relationship in general has been done at the high level or the government levels of both North and South Korea and even the United States. So what happens is you have a top-down fed method to try to resolve a conflict. Now, when you do something top-down, it has some benefits, but the problem is you're pushing your method down into the middle, into the people itself, instead of having the people support you and help you in many of those different ways that we look at and try to deal with conflicts. A top-down method by itself is never good for any type of thing we're trying to do within our own society, let alone when we're trying to affect others in other countries in the conflict resolution method we have. So what do we need to do differently? So as we looked at in the prior slide, this top-down only, where you're trying to have the most effect from the government level, pushing down on society and middle leaders or organizations of society, doesn't really work that well. So therefore, as you see on the screen here, we have a new structure for change. We have the pyramid as it's originally meant, the largest swath of the pyramid on the bottom, the foundation that deals with the people. You also have the middle level, the businesses, NGOs, academics, and others that deal with different levels of people, different levels of issues and challenges in society. Then you have the top, the leadership itself. How do we make this work? As you see a bar, an arrow to the top and bottom. And of course, that's the needs to be able to push information up and down the different levels of the pyramid itself. Then you have the lines on the bottom with arrows to left and right, and that's the amount of people that it affects. That's very important for us all to understand. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure that there's all these different levels are met at and worked on a regular basis. We need to make sure that the efforts are done over years, in decades, in fact, in order to make sure that it's done correctly. We also need to look at the best way to have these long-term positive, indirect, and direct levels of contact and engagement with the other society, to get to know one another, to learn to date, and get to know one another as a family once again. As I said earlier, we also have to look at the complexity of the situation. We have to have multiple complex efforts based on different levels of society to be most effective. In other words, just don't try one method, a negotiation or a meeting. Try multiple methods at one time and see which one may fan out or may have positive impact first, and then continue on with those other efforts as well. So here are some recommendations. These recommendations are not inclusive, but gives you a great idea of some of the things we need to do to help build a better relationship and eventual unification in the Korean Peninsula. Engagement exchange. Engagement exchange at all levels of society is very important. Not just tours in North Korea, tours in South Korea, but how do we really engage long term? The United States had a Fulbright program since the Cold War. And in fact, even during the darkest days of the Cold War, the United States had a Fulbright scholarships for the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union now, for Soviets to come to the United States and study at U.S. universities. Now, of course, we knew during the Cold War that everybody that came to the United States came over, they were Soviet agents. They worked for the KGB. But yet by bringing these adversaries or these others to our own country and allowing them to interact with our members of society on a long-term basis, we started to change the hearts and minds of the people, even the most hardened KGB agents out there. So if we can do that during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States had massive amount of nuclear weapons, we can certainly do that with North Korea to help create the conditions for change. Embassies and culture centers, just like the Fulbright scholarships we talked about earlier. The United States has always had a variety of embassies and consulates in the former Soviet Union, even during the missiles crisis and the Cuban Missiles Crisis in the 1960s and other eras. These embassies, these cultural centers, have the ability to create those avenues for these unofficial meetings to take place and for this high quality indirect contact to make a difference in society. I can say very firmly, without these embassies and cultural centers that we have between the United States and the former Soviet Union, we probably would have been on the verge of war until today. So therefore, embassies, cultural centers have a great talent to be able to work on these conflicts as well. Academic conferences and workshops. This is an example of what we can do to try to bring people together to have diverse ideas about how to resolve complex issues like the conflict with North Korea or complex issues within the greater region. There's so many vast amount of things we need to do, and by having more conferences, to have more people involved, even those that have different understandings and different ideas than your own, the better off we're going to be as a society, as a global society, to try to work on these things. So conferences and workshops are absolutely needed at all levels of society and at all different types of societies as well. Education and culture exchange. We talked about, earlier in the second section of it, we talked about the differences between North and South Koreans' understanding of history, culture, and even language. If you don't therefore have this exchange of knowledge on what culture and history may or may not mean, you certainly can't come up with a way to go ahead. So we need to have this robust education and culture exchange at the people level, not just the formal, but the informal is what I'm referring to here, in order for us to start to understand that we have more similarities than differences, whether we're Americans and North and South Koreans or whether we're just North and South Koreans together. each of us as humanity, as humans, have many more things in common, regardless of our form of government, than we have a difference between one another. We have to learn to understand that. We can only do that through robust exchange programs that we have. Additionally, part of culture and education is also fine arts and sports. You know, as I said, in my first session, the first session of this series, I talked about how sports and even the Olympics was a great form of diplomacy. In fact, it's called a positive conflict because you're getting these competing factions together to compete over sporting events. That also makes them better as individuals, as athletes, and makes them understand each other better. And that's what we need to do with fine arts and sports diplomacy as well. Even cooking, you know, as we know, the Korean food is being known around the world now. It's in the United States, it's everywhere, just like K-pop is. Why don't we take that and look at how food and fine arts and sports can be used to bring people closer together instead of moving them further apart. Also, cities and zones of peace. I've studied cities and zones of peace for a long time now, and I've noticed that there's many places calling themselves cities and zones of peace. But what does that really mean? It's just a name unless you make something happen. So we need to incorporate all these ideas and even more that I just spoke about into true cities and zones of peace, then have those measured and see how they're being effective over time. So these cities and zones of peace are important, but we need to have strong criteria to make sure that we're doing what we need to do in these cities and zones of peace. And Incheon and other countries, other areas in South Korea are great locations to have these cities and zones of peace. Capacity building. Earlier I talked about North Koreans, former North Koreans diaspora. We have over 30,000, more than that living around the world. We need to do more to leverage the capacity, the talent, and the understanding that these former North Koreans, these diaspora have, and to create the next generation of peacemakers. They should be part of this process in bringing their great ideas in to be able to understand the other and for them to understand us. So if we cannot be successful at bringing in the diaspora into communities and working with them to become better peacemakers and peace builders, then how can we do that? They can be the human bridges between the difference between North and South Koreans themselves. Using combination. I talked about hybridity and complexity earlier. It's about combination. It's about doing multiple things at one time. The government, we should not put the blame on the governments. We have to be able to take our own ideas and help the government and have the government help us become better peacemakers at the individual level, at the group level, at the social society level, and also at the government level. So all these different ideas and varieties we have in combination should be used. If we use those together with all these things I spoke about earlier and many more you're going to discover through your own group work we're going to have in just a few minutes after this presentation, we're going to be able to discover great new ways to work on unification, coexistence, and future peace on the Korean Peninsula. Additionally, have to think about long-term foreign policy. The democracies, of course, are great because we have the freedoms that we understand and we love, but also one thing about democracies is our governments change, and when our governments change, also our politics change, and therefore our efforts to deal with the other countries change. We have to learn to have long-term foreign policies that transcends changes in government. North Korea has one thing to advantage. They don't have changes in government, so therefore their policies are always long-term. We have to learn how to also have long-term, positive, democratic-built policies that do not change as governments change, administrations change. When we do that, we're going to be much better at the things we do. We have to support the efforts of NGOs and think tanks and civil society and academia. The government and governments around the world, to include the United Nations, should be supporting our efforts to try to help resolve different conflicts. We also have to create great conflict transformation or areas of transformation and to look at different research and research centers and support. There's so many variety of organizations that look at research, look at conflicts, and look at how to resolve issues at a certain level. But we don't do a good job of bringing these resources together as one group or as one overly large research center that has different research centers beneath it. We need to do that. We need to create great scholarship, new understandings and new theories based on Asian perspectives within this region itself. We also have to look at how do we build the next generation of conflict resolution and peace scholars, leaders around the world that can help mediate complex issues at all levels of our society than all levels of North Korean society and all levels of this great joint society we have after unification may take place. So in closing, we talked about a lot of things today. It was a packed hour, packed offline working sessions where we work in groups on a variety of issues. But I want you to know at the end of the day that the resolution or transformation of this relationship with North Korea and with the greater region and within the United States and within the region itself can change for the positive. But as we move forward, we have to make sure we don't forget about human rights and social justice, which is paramount for real, true, positive peace to take place. Also, we have to understand that we have to do this long-term and through complex methods and hybrid methods to look at the conflict in general. Finally, engagement. Engagement exchange at all levels over long-term must be done. So in closing, this is the end of the 4 sessions now, the 4th session of our boot camp series. We're going to be having, after the end of these actual sessions, when we have them offline, if you look at your screen, you can see the dates of the actual sessions themselves. We're also going to have a workshop where we take these young scholars that has learned from these 4 sessions, individual sections of these sessions, from all the great scholars that presented to you. We're going to take all those lessons learned. We're going to come together. We're going to work to it in a workshop style format to build about the great future we can all have together. And those young leaders, those young scholars, these former North Koreans, these South Korean scholars, these international young academic scholars are going to lead the way in trying to build what we should do next to come about resolution. It's been great having you on these 4 sessions in our boot camp, and we look forward to having you again in this workshop. Thank you very much for taking the time, and God bless you, and we hope for peace not only within this country and the region, but around the world. Thank you very much.